November 3rd, 1943, the Gestapo came to the library at 9:30 in the morning. They came with clipboards and cold eyes and the particular arrogance of men who believed that books held no secrets worth fearing. They walked between the shelves in their long coats, trailing fingers across spines, flipping through pages they could not read in a language they barely tolerated. They were looking for contraband, for weapons, for radios hidden beneath floorboards. They found none of those things. What they did not find, what they could not find, because they did not know how to look, were 47 hand-drawn Allied escape route maps, 3 sets of German troop movement intelligence, and the full name and address of every Gestapo informant operating in the Rhone Valley. All of it was sitting less than 2 meters from the ranking officer's left elbow, pressed flat inside the pages of a 1909 botanical encyclopedia that no one had checked out in 11 years. The librarian stood at her desk and watched them leave. Her name was Elise Marchand. She was 31 years old. She wore a gray cardigan and sensible shoes and a look of mild, professional inconvenience of kind a librarian reserves for patrons who return books with the spines cracked. The Gestapo agent paused at her desk on his way out and asked if she had seen any unusual visitors recently. She told him the library averaged 42 visitors per day, mostly elderly, mostly unremarkable. She offered him a borrowing card. He declined. The bell above it rang once, softly. Elise Marchand returned to her cataloging. Somewhere behind her, hidden in plain sight among 112,000 books, the war went on. She had grown up with the smell of paper. Her father, Georges Marchand, had been head librarian at the Bibliothèque Municipale de Lyon for 22 years before a quiet retirement gave way to a quieter death in the winter of 1938. He was a methodical man who believed sincerely, stubbornly, to the last that a well-organized library was among the finest instruments of civilization. He cataloged everything. He cross-referenced everything. He created nested index systems of his own invention that allowed him to locate any of the library's 60,000 books in under 4 minutes, blindfolded, in any order. He taught his daughter the same. Elise had not been the child who played in the park. She had been the child who reshelved returns and memorized the Dewey Decimal System at age 7 and spent Saturday afternoons creating dummy index cards to see if she could fool her father's searches. She rarely succeeded, but she learned something more valuable than accuracy. She learned how information could be hidden in a system, buried not by concealment but by misdirection, by placing a thing in exactly the wrong place. Lyon, in the early months of the occupation, had a particular quality of suspended dread. It was the largest city in the unoccupied zone Vichy, France. Technically, for a time it breathed slightly easier than Paris. But breathed was all it did. The milice, the French paramilitary collaborators, prowled the streets. Rationing turned neighbors suspicious. Collaborationist posters bloomed on stone walls like a rash. And beneath all of it, in the city's old resistance-era soul, something slow and determined was beginning to organize itself. The library remained open. This was not unusual. The Germans and the Vichy administrators who served them understood libraries as symbols of ordered society. A library suggested normality. Normality suggested compliance. Compliance was the goal. Elise understood this too, and she used it. Her recruitment into the resistance was not dramatic. There was no moonlit meeting, no whispered password in a cafe. A woman named Marguerite, former schoolteacher, steady-eyed and unremarkable, simply appeared at the returns desk one afternoon in March 1942 with a borrowed history of the Roman roads of Gaul. She returned it, thanked Elise for the recommendation, and asked, very quietly, whether Elise thought there might be space in the library's archive room for some materials that required very careful storage. Elise had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had stamped the returned book, filed it, and said that she would need to know the approximate dimensions of the materials in question. Marguerite smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had just found exactly what she needed. The first thing Elise did was map the library. Not physically, she knew the physical space as well as she knew her own hands. What she mapped was the attention, where the German officers who occasionally visited spent their time, which shelves they examined, which tables they chose, how long on average before the visit concluded. She recorded this in a small notebook she kept inside a hollowed-out French grammar textbook on the reference shelf, disguised as errata corrections in the margins. The archive room became the first secure location. It was temperature-controlled for preservation, which meant silent drafts, no vibrations from street traffic, no reason for casual entry. The secondary archive was accessible only through the main reading room, which meant anyone entering it had to pass Elise's desk. She had been managing that desk for 9 years. She could read a suspicious visitor in the time it took them to push through the front door. The first materials Marguerite delivered were modest: printed pamphlets, clandestine newspapers, resistance literature, simple coded messages to be forwarded to resistance cells in Grenoble and Marseille. These were inserted into periodical volumes with false dates on their spine labels, placed in a section of the periodicals archive that Elise had quietly reclassified under a subject heading so obscure that she was the only person who would ever have reason to consult it. Her father's lesson: the best hiding place is not darkness, it is irrelevance. The second wave of materials was more serious. In the autumn of 1942, the Allied air campaign over occupied Europe began generating a steady, tragic overflow of downed airmen who parachuted into French countryside with no papers, no language, no knowledge of the terrain, and German patrols closing within hours. The resistance network, called Réseau Combatif Combatline, and its allied organizations, needed something desperately: reliable, detailed, hand-drawn maps of escape routes through the massive Central and down toward the Spanish Pyrenees. Maps that could be reproduced, transported, and destroyed if intercepted. Maps that needed to exist but couldn't be seen to exist. Marguerite brought Elise her first set of such maps in January 1943. They were drawn on thin paper in pencil, unsigned, with German patrols marked in red. There were 12 of them, folded to the width of a bookmark. Elise looked at them for a long time, then did something that made even Marguerite inhale sharply. She walked to the natural history section, pulled a large format atlas from 1912, opened it to a double-page spread of the Auvergne region, and slid the escape route maps between the printed pages. The atlas was large enough to hold them flat and invisible. The atlas was also stamped with a condition code that meant archival reference only, not for general lending. No one borrowed it, no one ever had, but it was accessible, and Elise created a system. Every airman or resistance courier who needed access to the maps received, through Marguerite's network, a library borrowing card under a false name and a single instruction: ask the desk librarian for help locating materials on the regional geography of central France. This request, innocent, academic, the kind made by perhaps one visitor per month, was Elise's signal. She would guide them to the natural history section, help them locate the atlas, and leave them with it at a table while she returned to the desk. The maps were studied, memorized, or carefully traced. The atlas was returned. Nothing had happened. Between January and May of 1943, at least 19 Allied airmen moved through the library's reading room and out of occupied France. The Gestapo never knew. The milice never suspected. One elderly regular visitor, a former professor named Monsieur Delacour, sat at his usual table reading Proust on at least 3 occasions when the transaction took place within 4 meters of him. He noticed nothing, or if he did, he chose not to see. Elise began to expand. She developed a cataloging notation of barely perceptible mark on the card index, a single faint pencil dot in a specific corner that indicated which volumes in the library held concealed materials. She memorized the positions of over 40 such volumes across 11 subject sections. She created false reference numbers that linked apparently unrelated books into information chains that a trained courier could follow from shelf to shelf, extracting pieces of a message that assembled into instructions only when all pieces were collected. It was, in every sense, a library system, and it functioned with the precision her father had taught her to demand. The German officers who visited, growing more frequent as 1943 progressed, walked past it all every time. One particularly thorough young officer had once taken an interest in the atlas. He had pulled it from the shelf, turned it over in his hands, remarked that it seemed old, and slid it back. Elise had waited until he left before allowing herself a single quiet breath. His name was Hauptsturmführer Werner Brandt. He arrived in Lyon in June of 1943 as part of a Gestapo intelligence expansion following the Allied landings in North Africa, and he was, by every measure Elise's could apply, different from the men who had come before. He was not loud. He was not arrogant in the blunt, performative way of the officers who had preceded him. He was slight, pale, and precise, a man who had worked in document analysis before the war, according to what Marguerite's network was able to piece together. He understood libraries. He understood information systems. And he had begun, in his quiet way, to study the libraries of Lyon. He came to the Bibliothèque Municipale for the first time in late July, alone, with no clipboard and no entourage. He spent 2 hours in the reading room, speaking to no one, touching nothing. He simply observed. He watched how readers moved, which shelves they approached, how the librarian at the desk managed the flow of visits. He noted the catalog system. He examined the subject headings on sections of shelving. When he left, he stopped at Elise's desk and asked a single question. He asked whether the library maintained any system for tracking which sections received the most visitor attention. She told him no. That visitor tracking was not standard practice for a municipal reference collection. She said it pleasantly, helpfully, with the mild implication that it would be a rather tedious task. He nodded and thanked her. His eyes remained on her face for 2 seconds longer than the conversation required. She catalogued him in her mind the way she catalogued Emily. Threat level, high. Motivation, systematic. Timeline, unknown. That evening, she told Marguerite they needed 2 weeks of silence. The 2 weeks became 3. The library stayed open. The materials already concealed within it remained in closet. It was more dangerous to move them than to leave them. But no new deliveries arrived. No couriers came to study the atlas. The card index system was temporarily suspended. Elise continued her work with the appearance of perfect normality, restoring a collection of 18th century periodicals and organizing a reference lecture for university students that she had no intention of canceling. Normality was armor. She wore it like a second skin. Brandt returned 4 more times over the following 6 weeks. He developed a pattern. He would arrive mid-morning, spend an hour or 90 minutes in the reading room, occasionally request access to the archive room on some pretext to document verification, a research inquiry, and then leave. Each time, Elise accompanied him to the archive in accordance with library policy. Each time, she watched him with the same patient attention she gave to the card index. She noted which boxes he examined, which subject areas drew his attention, which items he photographed. He used a small Leica, casually, as though documenting architecture. He was mapping the library the same way she had. The realization arrived quietly, one morning in September as she was reshelving a volume of Montaigne. Brandt was not simply searching for contraband. He was looking for a system. He had intuited from what she could not know that the library's organizational logic might be layered, that there might be a second structure beneath the visible one. He was right, and he was getting closer. She had 3 days, she estimated. Perhaps 4. He had not yet found the notation system, the faint pencil dots on the card index, but he had begun photographing the index. If he studied those photographs with sufficient care, in sufficient light, the marks would become visible. She thought about this for 2 days. She did not tell Marguerite immediately, because Marguerite's instinct would be to remove the materials by force, in bulk, which risked exposure in transit, and would certainly trigger a search of whoever carried them. She thought about it in the way she thought about all cataloging problems systematically, backwards from the desired outcome. The desired outcome was that Brandt would find nothing, not because the materials were gone, but because they were invisible again. The notation system was the vulnerability. If the notation was removed, the information was still present, but unnavigable. Even if Brandt found a concealed document inside a book, he would have no way to know whether it was one of many or an isolated anomaly. She spent the evening of September 14th working late, alone in the library. This was not unusual. She regularly cataloged in the evenings, a habit of years. She worked through the card index methodically, erasing the pencil dots one by one, replacing them with a new system she had developed in the preceding 48 hours. The new notation was not a mark on the card. It was a positional code, a matter of millimeters in the vertical placement of each card within its drawer, visible only if you knew to measure, invisible if you were looking for a visible mark. The work took 4.5 hours. When she finished, she sat alone in the quiet library and allowed herself, very briefly, to feel afraid. The fear was not for herself exactly. It was for the men whose lives moved through this building in silence, through the pages of an old atlas, toward the Pyrenees and a war they were trying to return to. It was for Marguerite, who moved through the city with false papers and a smile that never cracked. It was for Monsieur Delacour, who read Proust at his usual table and perhaps knew more than he ever said. It was for all the invisible machinery of survival that operated in the space between what was seen and what was known. She locked the library at 11:37. She walked home through streets that held their breath under curfew. Brand came back on September 19th. He arrived at opening time, 9 o'clock, and he brought with him two subordinates and a request more demand than request to examine the card index in detail. He placed the index drawers on a reading table and began photographing them, systematically, one card at a time. His subordinates checked the archive room. They went through the periodicals section. They pulled volumes from shelves and examined their interiors with a small flashlight. Elise sat at her desk and processed borrowing requests with patient efficiency. She helped a student locate a chemistry text. She assisted an elderly woman with a crossword clue that required a 1938 encyclopedia. She answered the telephone twice. Brandt worked for 3 hours. He was thorough in a way that was almost elegant. She could see it, even from the desk, the methodical quality of his search. He was not a man who acted on anger. He acted on certainty. At 12:10, he came to her desk. He told her politely, in excellent French, that he had noticed irregularities in the physical arrangement of certain index cards. He said the cards showed very slight variations in their insertion depth, which he found unusual for a well-maintained system. He asked her whether there was an explanation. She looked at him. He looked at her. She told him that card drawers in any heavily used reference system accumulated small inconsistencies over time. Cards were pulled and replaced at speed. She was one librarian. The system was imperfect, all human systems were. She asked, politely, whether he had found any materials of concern. He had not. He admitted this without inflection. She told him she was sorry the visit had not been more productive, and offered to prepare a formal documentation of the library's organizational system, if that would assist his work. She said it warmly, collegiately, own person of professional precision speaking to another. He was quiet for a moment. Then he thanked her. He gathered his subordinates and left. He never came back. She learned later, through Marguerite's network, that Brandt had been reassigned in early October, transferred north, toward the escalating crisis in the Atlantic coast fortifications. She learned this without visible reaction. She filed it, but she did not remove the positional notation system. She left it in place, refined now, harder to see than ever, because the war was not over, and the atlas was still on the shelf, and the men who needed it were not yet safe. In the weeks that followed Brandt's departure, the library resumed its work. The pace accelerated because the pace of the war accelerated. By late autumn 1943, Allied bombing was increasing in its tempo and reach, which meant more aircraft, more crews, more downed airmen entering the French countryside with nothing but desperate need. The Comet Line and its associated networks were strained to the point of fracture. Marguerite brought Elise new materials twice in October. No just maps now, but intelligence documents, partial lists of informers compiled by resistance agents at considerable personal risk, and 2 sets of forged identity papers still awaiting photographs. The intelligence documents were the most dangerous items Elise had ever concealed. A list of Gestapo informers, if discovered on any person, was an immediate death sentence. She spent an evening with them, spread on her kitchen table, studying their dimensions and weight, thinking through the options with the same precise, ruthless logic she brought to everything. She placed them, ultimately, inside a 1909 botanical encyclopedia. Section on alpine grasses, page 312. It was, she reasoned, the last place anyone would look. It was also the first place she would look, if she were looking. She decided that was the appropriate kind of paradox. It was the kind her father would have appreciated. The winter of 1943 into 1944 was the longest of Elise's life, not because the operations ceased. They did not, because the weight of carrying them began, in small increments, to become visible. She lost weight, which she attributed to rationing, and no one questioned. She developed the habit of checking the library windows more often than was necessary, a motion she had trained herself to make look like routine adjusting the blinds against afternoon glare, a perfectly plausible gesture. She catalogued her own behavior the way she catalogued the collection, watching for signs of inconsistency, correcting drift. The isolation was the harder thing. She could not speak about what she knew to anyone who was not already inside the network. She sat at dinner with neighbors who discussed the BBC broadcasts in careful coded terms, and she nodded and said little. She had information that could have saved people, and there were times when the information was not hers to share and people were lost anyway. This was the arithmetic of resistance, and she knew it. She had agreed to it when she agreed to everything else. There were two close calls in early 1944 that she recorded in her hidden notebook as simply 17 February close. On February 17th, a courier who had been compromised by the militia was arrested 2 blocks from the library. He had not visited the library. He did not know the system's details, but he had been carrying a borrowed library card, a false name, but an Alice-issued card, and the militia issued card, and the militia arrived at the library the following morning to ask questions. Elise answered them. She showed them the borrowing records, complete, accurate, and entirely real because she kept 2 sets of borrowing records. The false names appeared in neither. The militia left. The curator of the library, a Vichy-appointed administrator named Pelletier, who maintained a careful indifference to everything beyond his salary, watched from his office door and said nothing. On March 4th, a German signals officer visited the library and spent 40 minutes examining books from the military history section. Kemeny Elise had deliberately kept entirely clean of concealed materials, precisely because it was the most obvious location for a targeted search. He found nothing. She noted the incident in her notebook with a kind of satisfaction that does not permit itself to look like satisfaction. By April 1944, the library had facilitated the passage of an estimated 43 Allied airmen and 15 resistance couriers. The intelligence documents hidden in the Botanical Encyclopedia had been extracted and forwarded twice, updated once, and returned each time without incident. Marguerite's network had grown significantly, and the atlas in the natural history section had been worn thin along its spine from careful, repeated openings, something Elise repaired herself with archival glue on a Tuesday afternoon when the library was empty. She was not heroic about any of it. She was precise about it, the way she was precise about everything. She did not think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as organized. Lyon was liberated in September of 1944. The Allied armies entered from the south and the west, and the German forces withdrew with the particular chaos of defeat, burning documents, abandoning equipment, moving in columns that raised dust visible from the library's upper windows. Elise watched from the window for a long moment and then returned to her desk. There was a backlog of returned books to process. The celebrations in the streets were genuine and overwhelming. Elise participated, because not participating would have been conspicuous, and she was still, by habit, careful about conspicuousness. She stood in the square with neighbors who wept and strangers who embraced, and she felt, beneath the relief, a complex quiet that she could not entirely name. Marguerite found her that evening at the library after closing. The schoolteacher looked older than she had 2 years earlier. They both did. Marguerite said that the network's records, painstakingly maintained, never found indicated that 61 people had moved through or been supported by systems Elise had maintained. That included airmen, couriers, Jewish families provided with forged papers, and at least 2 resistance operatives whose names never appeared in any official documentation. 61. Elise thought about that number the way she thought about catalog numbers as a fact, carrying weight, demanding accuracy. She nodded. She made tea. They sat together in the quiet library until well past midnight, and they did not speak very much, because the things between them did not require speaking. The cost was not visible in any obvious way. Her hands remained steady. She continued to work. But she had been carrying secrets for over 2 years in the specific, constant, impossible way that resistance work demands, not as a single dramatic burden, but as an accumulation of small decisions made every day, in every moment, with the awareness that a single miscalculation could end not only her own life, but those of everyone connected to her. That kind of weight does not simply set down when the war ends. She found, in the months after liberation, that she had difficulty sleeping in rooms with closed windows, that she noticed exits automatically upon entering any space, that she sometimes caught herself checking the card index for marks that were no longer there, running her fingertip along the tops of drawers in a gesture become muscle memory. She did not speak about this. She cataloged it. She gave it space in her interior index, filed under something she did not name, and she kept working. The library needed rebuilding not structurally, but in its collection, which had been stripped of certain materials by Vichy administrators and replaced with approved texts that now needed to be carefully removed and returned to proper classification. It was weeks of meticulous, satisfying work. It felt like cleaning a house after a long illness. The official recognition, when it came late and quietly. Resistance histories are complex things. They depend on who survived to tell them, on what documents were preserved or destroyed, on the political winds of post-war governments trying simultaneously to honor heroism and paper over collaboration. Many of the network's records, including Marguerite's careful logs, were not declassified until the 1980s, when French historians began the long work of reconstructing what had actually happened in the occupied cities. Elise was never publicly celebrated. She preferred it that way. When a researcher from the University of Lyon contacted her in 1971 to ask whether she had been involved with resistance activities during the occupation, she told him that she had been a librarian. She said it without irony because she meant it. She had been a librarian. The work she did had been the work of a librarian. The organizing, the cataloging, the attention to detail, the belief that information mattered and that its careful stewardship could mean the difference between survival and death. That was librarianship. It had simply been applied under unusual conditions. The researcher, a patient young man, asked her whether she thought what she had done was remarkable. She told him that she thought any system, well designed, would have produced similar results. Then she offered him tea and asked whether he would like to see the card index, which she had maintained and updated continuously for 30 years, and which was, she believed, the finest example of its kind in the municipal library system. He looked at the index for a long time, and then he asked her, carefully, whether she thought there was still anything hidden in it. She smiled at him. It was, witnesses later recalled, a particular kind of smile, the kind that belonged entirely to itself. She did not answer. Marguerite died in 1968. Monsieur Delacour outlived her by 3 years and left his copy of Proustal 7 volumesto, the library's permanent collection. In the margins of the 5th volume, in pencil so faint it required a magnifying glass to read, someone had written a series of numbers. They corresponded to no page numbers in the text. No one who examined them was ever certain what they meant. The Atlas's 1912 large-format Atlas of the Auvergne region, natural history section remains in the Bibliothèque Municipale de Lyon today. Its spine has been repaired at least 3 times. The repair work is professional, careful, and slightly different in technique from the repairs visible on comparable volumes of the same age. Historians who have examined it note this, but offer no definitive explanation. Inside the atlas, on pages 78 and 79, the double-page spread of the massive central shows the terrain in careful printed detail. Along the river valleys and mountain passes, if you look very closely under certain light, there are faint pencil marks, barely there, the ghost of something once present and then erased. Or perhaps it is simply the age of the paper. It is not always possible to know. Elise Marchand continued as head librarian of the Bibliothèque Municipale until her retirement in 1978. She lived to 1994 and is buried in the Nouveau Cimetière de la Guillotière in Lyon under a stone that reads, Biblioteca 1994, nothing 94, nothing more. She left the library her personal book collection, some 800 volumes, carefully catalogued, with her own notation system documented in a handwritten guide she prepared in her final year. The guide is meticulous. It is, by every expert account, a masterpiece of organizational logic. But archivists who have studied it note that several of the notation codes have no corresponding entries in the collection. They appear in the guide. They reference categories. And then they simply stop, as though pointing to something that is no longer there, perhaps was never there at all, or perhaps was there, and then was moved again, and in the movement became invisible. A librarian's trick, the oldest kind. Hide it not in darkness, hide it in the system itself. Make it so perfectly placed that it cannot be seen for what it is, only for what it pretends to be. Give it a false number. Give it a shelf. Give it a life among the other books, unremarkable, unhurried, patient. Information, Elise once wrote in a private letter discovered among her papers, does not need to shout, it only needed to wait. In the autumn of 1943, a German intelligence officer named Werner Brandt sat in a reading room in Lyon and searched for something he could almost see but never quite locate. Around him, on every shelf, the evidence of what he was looking for breathed quietly inside old spines and foxed pages. He was precise, he was methodical. He was, in his way, very good at his work. And he missed it, all of it, because the woman at the desk was better. Because she had grown up with the smell of paper and the logic of systems and a father who believed, sincerely and correctly, that the right way to keep a secret is to give it a home. It belongs into, file it so carefully, in so right a place that the only person who could ever find it is the one who built the index. The Gestapo came to the library on November 3rd, 1943. They searched for 2 hours. They found nothing. They left, and the bell above the door rang once, softly, as it always did, as it had rung for years, as it would ring for years still to come. The librarian returned to her work. The books kept their secrets. And the war for 61 people turned out differently than it otherwise would have.